Tomorrow, as our nation celebrates Independence Day, we'll reflect on events that took place so long ago and the benefits and consequences of those actions. In the same way as Christians, we live today and every day in the victory and the salvation and the hope that are ours because of the independence from sin and death and the promise of eternity with God in heaven. When Jesus prepared for his journey to the cross, each day leading up to those events served to prepare himself and his disciples and all those around him for what was about to come. And in Matthew 24, we find one of the most intriguing and fascinating and controversial passages in all the New Testament. And we're going to take time with it today. It's hard to imagine the shock when Jesus told the disciples, as they looked at those beautiful buildings, that within one generation, not one stone would be left upon another. It would all be taken down. That structure that had been rebuilt after the exile and then extended by Herod the Great, that was famous throughout the known world for its grandeur and its beauty, that represented God among his people. There was the holy place and the most holy, the Ark of the Covenant. There were the sacrifices that were made. There were those events, not all of which continued into this temple, and yet so much of it did, the records of the priest's genealogy, so that they could identify which part each one would play. To take down the temple would be to take down their religion, their life, their world. It was the most stable, steady, immovable thing in their lives. And yet, at the same time, with all that Jesus says about what's coming regarding the fall of Jerusalem and the ultimate end of the world, here in Mark and Luke, he notes this widow who has so little to give and yet so much to give in her simple faith. And so it may be with many of us. We may not have all the answers. We may not have everything figured out. But when we live by faith, when we give by faith, when we put our confidence in God, makes me admire again all the widows and widowers among us and the example you set for me and every person among us. Oh, that lepton, it was nothing, and yet it was everything because it was all that she had, smaller than a penny or even a dime. And yet Jesus said she gave more because others out of their surplus, what they could spare, what they didn't really need. But she, all that she had to rely on for her needs, she put in the hands of God. A person that lives by faith in the Lord does not have to worry or fear about today or tomorrow or eternity. And you and I know that even after her generous effort, God provided for her. Matthew 24 has, in a way, a simple message, 3 parts to it. The temple is going to fall within one generation. If you go back to the end of Matthew 23, you remember how Jesus wept over the city, and he wanted to gather his fellow Israelites and protect them as a mother hen would her chicks, but they weren't willing. And he said, "Behold, your house is left to you desolate." That's the temple. And he said it would all come upon this generation. But then in Matthew 24, he goes on to talk about a day and an hour, as Lou read, which no one could predict or forecast. We'll note in a moment that people have tried to nail the date of his coming based on Matthew 24, but it's an erroneous effort. And so be prepared, like a thief in the night, like the days of Noah. All of a sudden, boom, and the waters come, and it's over, and it's too late to make a change in whether you're in or out. So you set your sights now, and then the judgment would follow. 4 stories then will continue next Lord's Day that talk about preparation and setting your sights on that great day that's going to come. But he begins with a spectacular sight and then this shocking prediction. The disciples are talking about, look how adorned, look how beautiful, look how amazing the temple is. And for Jesus to speak so bluntly and so powerfully about its downfall, you can almost hear the gasp. How could it possibly be? Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, described the temple as having on the exterior lacking nothing that would astound the mind or the eye. Approaching strangers from a long way away might see what looked like a snow-clad mountain, but as you came closer and closer, you could see the gold reflecting the sunlight, and you'd have to close your eyes or turn them away because it was simply blinding. I found this past week a 3D tour. There's the link. It'll be in your email tomorrow. And it will take you into this massive structure, and then you'll see the gold, and you'll go inside, and there the menorah, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the holy place, and then that which was most holy. Oh, that structure. The Temple Mount covered about 35 acres. It's today 1/6 of the total area of the old city. It attracted the attention of people from all over the world and made Jerusalem famous. And what you can see on the side, the retaining walls put in place under the orders of Herod the Great, massive and perfect in the way they're cut and they're stacked, layer upon layer upon layer. Those stones remain. But the temple itself, just as Jesus said, within 40 years, AD 70, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, Luke 21:20. The Romans came and invaded and carried out this forecast which came from the lips of the Savior. So now back to Matthew 24:3. They're asking, what does this mean? When will it happen? What's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Are these two questions or three or one? Did they see that when the temple comes down, that must be the end of history, the culmination of everything from the beginning? It's all done and over, the consummation. Or could they see maybe two different events as Jesus will describe them? First, the temple's destruction, and then down the road, his return. Look at chapter 24 and note, first of all, Jesus talks about some things that, regardless of what people say today, are not signs of the end. You ever hear or see maybe in entertainment media where, earthquakes and famines and wars in the Middle East, here's this nation against this nation, here's this terror that has struck, here's this evil power that has come to rise, and the people go flipping through Matthew 24 and say, hey, Jesus said these things were coming. That means he's about to return. That's the opposite of what he said. He said, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes in various places and nation rising up against nation, these are things that do not tell you the end is almost here. There'll be false Christs, and there were. There will be tribulation, not just at the end, but even immediately after Jesus went back to heaven. Death and hatred for the disciples. People will betray each other. The disciples will give up, some of them. Their love for the Lord will grow cold, and false prophets will say, hey, look here, do this, follow such and such. Some will not endure, but he said those that do endure to the end will be saved. Don't be unsettled, he said. And such is the message for us today. With all of the upheaval, all of the changes, all the rise and fall of individuals and forces and armies, all that may happen with someone's economy or with something across the world or in our own backyard, we certainly pray for peace, and we know the gospel is the source of harmonious relationships between people. But we're not set at a loss when things in this world are broken, when they're messed up, but neither do we say, hey, this must be the time he's about to come. But then look at verses 15 through 16. But when you see this, it's time to flee to the mountains. What is it, this unusual phrase, the abomination of desolation, standing where it ought not? As Daniel wrote, let the reader understand. And you and I are the reader, and we say, I want to understand. Tell me about it. What is that? Well, an abomination is something hateful or dreadful or repulsive. And desolation is something that's deserted, something that's emptied out, something that becomes like a ghost town. Now remember, at the end of chapter 23, Jesus said, your house, the temple, will be left to you desolate in this generation. Luke records Jesus' message. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. That's what it is. Look at Luke 21:20. And it interprets for us the abomination of desolation. The phrase itself goes back to Daniel. And in Daniel's time, he was allowed to see that the temple would be desecrated. Even before Christ came, there was a man, an evil Syrian ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes. And he defiled the temple, and he sacrificed a pig, an unclean animal there. It was horrendous to the Jews. And in this telescoping, where Daniel was able to see more than one event, where something dreadful, something horrible, something unspeakable would happen to the holy place and make it desolate and empty, Jesus took that phrase that was familiar to his disciples and said, that's what's going to happen. And when you see it, don't stay where you are, but with all speed and all energy, never looking back, you flee to the mountains. And by the way, Josephus, that historian we mentioned a moment ago, who was not a follower of Christ by any means, recorded in his writings that when the Romans attacked, many of the Christians fled to Pella, a hilly region beyond the city, and they survived. And those that remained within lost their lives. And so Jesus goes on to say, you can see it's a local event. What he's talking about up to this point is not the end of history. It's the end of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of the temple. It is the attack of the Roman invaders. And you can tell it is that by what you see here. He speaks of those in Judea. Well, the second coming is going to be for all who are throughout the world. Flee to the mountains. Well, that won't do any good at the second coming. There'll be no way of escape. Don't go back to your house to get your clothes or your other precious objects or items. There's no time to lose. Obviously, when Christ returns, there'll be no opportunity to go back to the house. Hopefully, a woman will not be pregnant or nursing. Why? Because it would be more difficult to run before the army's attack. Or if it's on the Sabbath, oh no, because the Jews had limited themselves with what they called a Sabbath day's journey that Acts chapter 1 mentions. They could only go so far from their property on the seventh day. And so when Jesus speaks of your flight, pray that your flight will not take place in the winter. Why? Because once again, the circumstances would hinder a rapid escape. So it's very clear he's talking about what's going to happen to Jerusalem, those things that would not indicate it's almost here, and that which would, when you see the abomination coming, Luke says, the city will be surrounded by armies. Then you run and run and run. When we come to this next passage about immediately after the tribulation of these days, we read language that many have understood to refer to the second coming, because it talks about the sun darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky, the powers of the heavens shaken, the sign of the Son of Man appear in the sky, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, sending forth the angels with a great trumpet, and gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. People say, wait a minute, he'd been talking about Jerusalem falling, and now he says immediately after that, these events will occur. Jesus couldn't have been saying that his second coming would occur immediately after the fall of Jerusalem, because his words are perfect and without error in every detail. So there must be some understanding of these words. If you have the New American Standard Bible, as I do, you will see that the phrase after phrase after phrase are quoted from the Old Testament. And that's going to be a clue for us, especially as we may not be as familiar with prophecy as would benefit us. But in verse 29, the phrase, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall. These are words used all the way back in Isaiah chapter 13 of events that had already happened hundreds of years before Christ came. You see, the prophets used this kind of language as if when God judges a defiant power, when God overturns a rebellious emperor, when God intervenes in history and drops the hammer, the prophets would describe that as, hey, the sky's falling. The earth is shaking. Everything's turned upside down. There's no sunshine. There's no moonlight. Everything is chaotic and crazy. This kind of imagery, which is not as familiar to us, helps us understand that Jesus is describing the fall of Jerusalem in the same way that the prophets described the fall of Babylon, Isaiah 13. And you can look at a number of other scriptures that use this very same kind of language. Even when it comes to the phrase about gathering the elect, that's also quotation, and people mourning over these events. And so when Jesus talks about divine judgment, he uses words that all of those listening to him would have understood, as they would have understood Daniel, the abomination of desolation. Oh, that means something awful is going to happen in the temple. And they would have recognized Jesus' direct quotations from Isaiah as talking about God stepping in and responding to his own people because of their disobedience and their unbelief and their rejection of Jesus Christ. And so these words describe even the coming on the clouds of the sky, quoted from Daniel 7. When you and I hear Jesus coming on the clouds of the sky, we perhaps first think right off of the end of time. But the fact is, Daniel saw a vision. Look at Daniel 7:13, in which he saw the Son of Man, we know that's going to be Christ, go up to the Ancient of Days, the Father on the throne, and receive a kingdom and glory and dominion and power. So the Son of Man coming on the clouds, yes, at the end of history, we will see, remember Acts 1 when he ascended and the two men in white, the angel said, you'll see him come again exactly as you've seen him go. Yes, he's going to come on the clouds. But this phrase, coming on the clouds, can refer to anything that indicates he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. If we were to turn to Matthew 26, when Jesus is on trial before the Jewish authorities, he tells the high priest, you personally, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, the high priest didn't witness, obviously, the end of time, which has not yet occurred. but he would have been there when the Romans came and the city of Jerusalem fell. And so that vision in Daniel 7, noted frequently. By the way, this evening we'll continue our series in Revelation, God's last word, greetings from the throne, and we will see this same promise made, that is, the Son of Man coming in the clouds. We have a bracket also. Before this happened, Jesus was talking about the local attack in Jerusalem. And now after these words of prophetic imagery about the constellations and all of those things being disrupted, he says in verse 34, all these things will take place before this generation passes away. So here, the other bookend, we have something before that cosmic passage and right after it that set the time frame as coming within the next number of years. The people living at the time that Jesus spoke. To go back to Matthew 23, it was there. Look at verse 36. All these things, he's talking about the punishment of the Jews, the leaders, for their rebellion against God. All these things will come upon this generation. Your house is being left to you desolate. A number of years back, people who misunderstood Matthew 24 and thought that this generation might refer to the final generation that's going to be on earth and not the people living at the time of Christ, came to believe that the fig tree that's mentioned in verse 32 was the nation of Israel. And they thought that if Israel became a nation again, that would begin the final generation and usher in the second coming. And so part of the rationale in 1948 for so many in the world helping Israel to become a state, a nation, many who took this passage and thought this generation, that has to be the final generation. Let's see if we can't get it going with the fig tree, that is Israel, being an entity again. And then they began to say Christ will come within one generation of 1948. And so there were many documents written promising that probably by 1988, 40 years after 1948, Christ will come. Well, obviously it didn't happen. One of the reasons it didn't happen is because no one knows the day or the hour that he's coming, but the other is it was a misunderstanding of the phrase, this generation, which Jesus used to speak of his own contemporaries. And so within 40 years of that time, the Romans came. Now, as we heard read a moment ago, here's a transition. And Jesus has been talking about those days and things that will happen, but they're not the sign of the Romans coming. But here's something that is a sign, this abomination. When you see it, get out. Now he moves from those days to that day. And instead of saying, you'll know it's here when you see armies surrounding, or you'll know it here by this, he says, you won't know it's here until it is here. It will be like the time of Noah. The people did not understand until the flood actually came. And at that time, it was too late for them to join in with Noah and his family and those animals. And so Jesus goes on to say that when he comes again, you don't know. If the thief had known, he surely would have called ADT. He would have had all the lights on, had the police there, stayed up awake. But it's when he's asleep that the burglar comes and enters his home. And so Jesus said, be ready. Because you cannot predict, you cannot forecast, you cannot look at signs and tell when his coming will be. Now let's say while we're here in Matthew 24, we mentioned Daniel and telescoping. That is where Daniel could talk about the abomination of desolation with Antiochus Epiphanes, but also what would come with the Romans, as Jesus noted. So you can see the fall of Jerusalem, a short-term prophecy from the Lord, verifies the long-term. We haven't seen him come again, but we've seen AD 70 and its effects that remain today. And because he said that in advance and it happened, we know for that and other reasons that what he said about the end of time is right. Two events, and yet they're parallel. They're both certain to occur, both acts of judgment, both catch most people by surprise, both call for faithful preparation, and both would be final in their effects. So you think about the fall of Jerusalem then, and you think about the return of Jesus Christ at some unexpected, unpredicted, unknown day and time. And you can kind of see down the telescope. That happened to them because they weren't prepared. They could have escaped if they'd obeyed Jesus Christ. And when the end of this world comes, you too and I can escape by obedience to Christ. Next, he's going to illustrate the importance of preparation with 4 stories that he will tell. But it causes you and me to ask ourselves, if it were today, and it could be, are you ready for that great day to come? Within the last week or more, 5 precious souls have been baptized into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins. They've entered into a covenant with him, a relationship as part of his kingdom. If you would make that response today or want to learn more about it, or if we can assist you in any way as you prepare for a great day that is certain to come, please respond. Let's stand and sing.